Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy glass doors of Fort Braxton's Intelligence Analysis Center at exactly 7:45 a.m., just like she had every morning for the past 3 years. Her worn leather bag bounced against her hip as she hurried down the sterile hallway, past the portraits of decorated generals who seemed to watch her with silent judgment. At 28, Sarah looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length brown hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses that made her appear more like a college librarian than someone working at one of the most classified military facilities in North Carolina. But appearances, as Sarah had learned the hard way, could be deceiving. "Morning, filing girl," called out Lieutenant Commander Ryan Walsh from behind his desk as Sarah passed the main operations room. The name stung every time he used it, which was daily. Walsh was everything Sarah wasn't: tall, confident, and bearing the kind of military bearing that commanded instant respect. His perfectly pressed uniform gleamed with ribbons and commendations, while Sarah wore simple civilian clothes that marked her as support staff. Sarah kept walking, pretending not to hear the snickers that followed from the other analysts gathered around Walsh's desk. These were the real intelligence officers, the ones who briefed generals, who made decisions that affected national security, who mattered. Sarah just filed their reports, or so they thought. The truth was far more complicated. Sarah had been recruited straight out of MIT, where she'd earned dual degrees in computer science and cognitive psychology, but a series of budget cuts and bureaucratic reshuffling had landed her in the administrative pool instead of the analyst track she'd been promised. For 3 years, she'd been told it was temporary. For 3 years, she'd waited for her chance to prove herself. For 3 years, she'd been invisible. Sarah's workspace was a cramped cubicle in the basement level, surrounded by filing cabinets that reached the ceiling and hummed with the constant whir of climate control systems, protecting thousands of classified documents. Her official title was Records Management Specialist, but everyone knew what that really meant. She was the filing girl. Her supervisor, Margaret Kowalski, barely looked up when Sarah arrived at her desk. Margaret was a career civil servant who'd worked her way up from secretary to department head through sheer persistence and an encyclopedic knowledge of military bureaucracy. She had little patience for what she saw as Sarah's unrealistic ambitions. "Sarah, I need you to process the overnight intelligence reports from the Berlin station," Margaret said without preamble, pointing to a stack of manila folders that seemed to have grown overnight. "Priority classification, so no delays. The analysts upstairs are breathing down my neck." "Of course," Sarah replied, settling into her chair. This was her daily routine: receiving classified intelligence reports, organizing them by threat level and geographic region, then filing them in the appropriate secure databases. It was mind-numbing work that most people would find overwhelming due to the sheer volume of information. But Sarah had a secret weapon that none of her colleagues knew about. As she opened the first report, her eyes moved across the pages with practiced efficiency. To anyone watching, it would look like she was simply reading and organizing. But Sarah's brain was doing something extraordinary. It was photographing every single word, every number, every detail with perfect clarity. Sarah had what neurologists called eidetic memory, though she preferred the more common term, photographic memory. She could recall with perfect accuracy anything she'd ever read, seen, or heard. Every classified report that had crossed her desk in 3 years was stored in her mind, like files in a computer database. The morning reports painted a familiar picture of global tensions: terrorist chatter from the Middle East, Russian submarine movements in the Baltic, Chinese cyber attacks on American infrastructure. Sarah processed each document methodically, her memory automatically cross-referencing details with thousands of other reports she'd filed. Over the years, it was in the third report from Berlin that something caught her attention. The document described a routine surveillance operation targeting a suspected Russian intelligence officer, operating under diplomatic cover. Agent designation, Blackbird. The report was signed by CIA Station Chief David Morrison, a man Sarah had never met but whose reports she'd been filing for 2 years. But something was wrong. Sarah closed her eyes and let her mind scan back through her memory files. Morrison's previous reports had always included specific details about his surveillance teams, call signs, equipment serial numbers, weather conditions. These weren't just bureaucratic details. They were authentication markers that proved the reports were genuine. This report had none of those markers. More troubling, the writing style was different. Morrison always used specific military terminology and followed a rigid reporting format. This report used civilian language and included details that seemed designed to misdirect rather than inform. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. In 3 years of filing intelligence reports, she'd never seen anything like this. Either Morrison had suddenly abandoned years of training and protocol, or someone else had written this report using his credentials, someone with access to classified CIA communication channels, someone who knew exactly how to make a fake report look authentic enough to fool the analysts upstairs, someone who was feeding false intelligence into the American military system. Sarah glanced around the empty filing room, suddenly aware of how isolated she was down here. Above her, she could hear the muffled sounds of the analysts going about their important work, trusting that the information they received was accurate and authentic. They had no idea that someone might be manipulating the very intelligence they relied on to protect American lives. But Sarah knew. And now she faced an impossible choice. She could report her suspicions through proper channels, but who would believe her? She was just the filing girl, a glorified secretary whose job was to organize papers, not analyze them. Lieutenant Commander Walsh and his team would laugh her out of the building if she tried to tell them that her feeling about a report suggested there was a double agent in their midst, or she could investigate further on her own, using her unique memory and access to thousands of classified documents to build a case that no one could ignore. The risk was enormous. If she was wrong, her career would be over. If she was right but couldn't prove it, she'd be dismissed as a paranoid file clerk with delusions of grandeur. But if she was right and did nothing, how many American agents might die from compromised intelligence? Sarah looked at the Berlin report again, her photographic memory already comparing it to every other document Morrison had ever filed. The differences were subtle but unmistakable to someone who remembered everything. She made her decision. For the rest of the morning, Sarah continued her normal filing routine, but now every document she processed was being analyzed through a different lens. She was no longer just organizing information. She was hunting for patterns, inconsistencies, and clues that might reveal the scope of the infiltration. By lunchtime, she'd found 3 more suspicious reports from different stations, all bearing the same subtle markers that had caught her attention in Morrison's file. Someone was systematically feeding false intelligence into the American military system. Someone with access to communication channels from Berlin, Prague, and Istanbul. Someone who understood exactly how to craft reports that would pass initial screening, but misdirect American operations. Sarah sat in her basement cubicle, surrounded by the humming filing cabinets that held the secrets of American intelligence operations, and realized she might be the only person in the entire facility who knew they had been compromised. The only question now was whether anyone would listen to the filing girl before it was too late. As the afternoon shift began to arrive upstairs, Sarah carefully locked the suspicious reports in her desk drawer and began planning her next move. She had no official authority, no credentials that would get her a meeting with the facility commander, but she had something more powerful than authority. She had the truth, and she was going to make sure the truth came to light, no matter how many people tried to dismiss her as just another paper pusher who didn't understand the real world of intelligence operations. They were about to learn that sometimes the most important battles are fought, not by the people in uniform, but by the ones everyone overlooks, the ones who see everything, remember everything, and refuse to stay silent when lives are at stake. Sarah spent her lunch break in the facility's small cafeteria, picking at a turkey sandwich while her mind raced through the implications of what she'd discovered. Around her, analysts and officers discussed weekend plans and office gossip, completely unaware that their conversations might be overheard by someone feeding intelligence to enemy handlers. She forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need energy for what came next. Her plan was simple but dangerous. Use her after-hours access to the filing system to conduct a comprehensive review of intelligence reports from the past 6 months. If there was a pattern of false intelligence being inserted into the system, her photographic memory would find it. The afternoon dragged by with excruciating slowness. Sarah processed routine reports while mentally cataloging every detail that might be relevant to her investigation. By 5:30 p.m., the main analysis floor had emptied out as the day shift headed home to their families. Sarah waited until the building settled into its evening quiet before making her move. Her keycard gave her access to the secure filing areas during off hours, a privilege that came with her security clearance but one she'd never used for anything beyond her assigned duties. Tonight would be different. The basement filing area felt different in the evening darkness, with only emergency lighting casting long shadows between the towering cabinets. Sarah moved systematically through the classified archives, pulling files from intelligence stations across Europe and the Middle East. What she found made her blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, there had been a steady stream of subtly altered intelligence reports from key CIA stations. The changes were small but significant. Altered coordinates for terrorist safehouses, incorrect timetables for enemy movements, modified personnel information for foreign assets. Each individual report would have passed routine security checks, but when viewed together through Sarah's perfect memory, they formed a clear pattern of systematic misinformation designed to compromise American operations. The most chilling discovery came in a report from the Istanbul station, dated just 2 weeks ago. It contained details about a planned raid on a suspected arms dealer, details that Sarah realized had been deliberately altered to send American forces into an ambush. She quickly cross-referenced the date with news reports she remembered reading. There it was, a brief mention in the international section about an incident involving American military advisors in Turkey. 3 soldiers wounded, 1 critically. The official report blamed faulty local intelligence, but Sarah now knew the truth. Those soldiers had been wounded because someone had deliberately fed their commanders false information about the target location and enemy strength. Her hands trembled as she photographed the documents with her secure phone, building a file of evidence that painted a terrifying picture of infiltration at the highest levels of American intelligence. By midnight, Sarah had identified 17 suspicious reports from 8 different stations, all bearing the same subtle markers that revealed them as forgeries. Someone with extraordinary access and sophisticated knowledge of CIA protocols was systematically undermining American operations. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work with a new sense of urgency. She needed to report her findings, but she also knew that approaching this the wrong way could destroy any chance of being taken seriously. She decided to start with Margaret Kowalski, her immediate supervisor. Margaret had been in the intelligence community for 30 years and would understand the implications of what Sarah had discovered. "Margaret, I need to speak with you about something urgent," Sarah said, clutching a folder containing printouts of her evidence. Margaret barely looked up from her computer screen. "If it's about the new filing protocols, I already told you." "It's about compromised intelligence reports," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've identified a pattern of false information being inserted into our systems." That got Margaret's attention. She leaned back in her chair and studied Sarah with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Compromised how?" Sarah opened her folder and spread out copies of the suspicious reports. These documents all appear to be authentic CIA intelligence, but they contain subtle alterations designed to misdirect our operations. The writing style, authentication markers, and operational details all indicate they're forgeries. Margaret glanced at the papers for less than 30 seconds before pushing them back across her desk. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but analyzing intelligence reports isn't your job. These documents have already been processed and verified by trained analysts. But if you just look at the pattern, I don't need to look at anything." Margaret cut her off sharply. "Your job is to file reports, not to second-guess the professionals who write them. I suggest you focus on your actual responsibilities instead of playing detective." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on. "Margaret, please. I have a photographic memory. I can see patterns that others might miss. These reports are putting American lives at risk." Margaret's expression hardened. "A photographic memory? Sarah, this isn't a comic book. Intelligence analysis requires years of training and experience, not party tricks. If you continue to waste time on these fantasies instead of doing your actual job, we'll need to have a more serious conversation about your future here." Dismissed and frustrated, Sarah returned to her cubicle, but she wasn't ready to give up. If Margaret wouldn't listen, she'd have to find someone who would. That afternoon, Sarah waited until Lieutenant Commander Walsh was alone in his office before approaching his door. Through the glass, she could see him reviewing tactical reports, his military bearing evident even while seated. She knocked softly and entered when he looked up. "Yes?" Walsh said, his tone suggesting he had better things to do than talk to support staff. "Sir, I'm Sarah Mitchell from Records Management. I've discovered what I believe to be a serious security breach in our intelligence reports." Walsh leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "The filing girl wants to brief me on security breaches? This should be interesting." Sarah laid out her evidence as clearly as she could, explaining the patterns she'd identified and the implications for ongoing operations. Walsh listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a child. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Ms. Mitchell, let me explain something to you. The documents you handle have already been analyzed by some of the most qualified intelligence professionals in the world. They've been vetted, cross-checked, and verified through multiple channels before they ever reach your filing cabinet. But sir, if you would just, what you're describing," Walsh continued, "would require someone with access to CIA communication systems, detailed knowledge of operational protocols, and the ability to forge documents that would fool trained analysts. Do you understand how impossible that scenario is?" Sarah felt her hopes sinking. "I understand it sounds unlikely, but unlikely?" Walsh stood up, his full height towering over her. "Ms. Mitchell, what you're suggesting would mean there's a highly placed double agent with access to some of our most sensitive communications. That's not unlikely. It's paranoid fantasy." He moved around his desk to stand closer to her, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "I think what's happening here is that you've been reading too many spy novels. You want to feel important, to be more than just someone who organizes papers. But the real world of intelligence operations isn't like the movies." Sarah's face burned with humiliation, but she tried one more time. "Sir, I have a documented eidetic memory. I can recall every detail of every report I've processed. The patterns I'm seeing are real." Walsh actually laughed. "Eidetic memory? Ms. Mitchell, even if such a thing were real, which most scientists doubt, it wouldn't qualify you to analyze classified intelligence. That requires training, experience, and security clearance levels you don't possess." He returned to his desk and sat down, clearly considering the conversation over. "I suggest you return to your filing duties and leave the intelligence analysis to the professionals. And Ms. Mitchell, if I hear that you're bothering other officers with these theories, we'll need to discuss your continued employment here." Sarah left Walsh's office feeling crushed, but not defeated. Two senior officials had dismissed her concerns without seriously examining her evidence. But she knew what she'd seen, and she knew American lives were at stake. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. If the official channels wouldn't listen to her, she'd have to find another way to expose the truth. She stayed late again, this time accessing not just intelligence reports, but personnel files, communication logs, and administrative records. Her photographic memory allowed her to process vast amounts of information in a way no one else could. And in those records, she found something that made her heart stop. The pattern of false intelligence reports coincided perfectly with the duty schedules of someone with access to CIA communication systems, someone who worked night shifts when oversight was minimal, someone who had been in the right places at the right times to insert false information into the intelligence stream, someone who worked in this very building. As Sarah stared at the personnel file in front of her, she realized the scope of the betrayal was far worse than she'd imagined. The double agent wasn't some distant enemy operative. It was someone she saw every day. Someone who knew she'd been investigating the false reports. Someone who might already know that she was getting too close to the truth. Sarah's hands shook as she realized she was no longer just fighting to be taken seriously. She was fighting for her life. And tomorrow she would have to face the double agent without them knowing that she knew their identity. The game had become deadly serious, and Sarah was playing it completely alone. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the personnel file that had revealed the truth. Margaret Kowalski had been working night shifts for the past 8 months, always on the same nights when the false intelligence reports had been inserted into the system. Her supervisor, the woman who had dismissed her concerns so quickly, the person who controlled access to the very files Sarah had been investigating. Margaret wasn't just ignoring the security breach, she was the security breach. The next morning, Sarah forced herself to maintain her normal routine, but every interaction with Margaret felt like walking through a minefield. She had to act naturally while gathering the final pieces of evidence needed to expose a trained intelligence operative who had been betraying her country for months. "Good morning, Sarah," Margaret said with her usual brisk efficiency. "I need you to process the overnight reports from our European stations." "Priority handling." Sarah nodded and took the stack of files, her photographic memory automatically, noting that Margaret's hands showed slight ink stains, the kind that came from handling documents that had been recently printed, rather than transmitted through secure channels. More evidence that Margaret was creating fake reports right here in the building. As Sarah worked through the morning's intelligence reports, she began to see the full scope of Margaret's betrayal. The false information wasn't random. It was strategically designed to compromise specific operations while making American intelligence appear unreliable to allied nations. 3 CIA assets in Eastern Europe had gone dark after operations based on Margaret's false reports. American military advisors had been withdrawn from 2 critical regions after intelligence failures that made local commanders lose trust in American capabilities. Margaret wasn't just passing information to enemy handlers. She was systematically destroying America's intelligence relationships around the world. Lunchtime, Sarah had identified the pattern completely. Margaret used her access to the secure filing system to insert false reports during night shifts, then ensured those reports were prioritized and distributed before anyone could examine them too closely. It was a perfect system, managed by someone who understood every aspect of intelligence processing and had been trusted with access to the most sensitive information. But Margaret had made one critical mistake. She hadn't accounted for someone with a photographic memory who could spot patterns that would be invisible to anyone else. Sarah was about to leave for lunch when Margaret approached her cubicle with an expression she'd never seen before. Instead of her usual businesslike demeanor, Margaret looked almost concerned. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Margaret said, her voice carefully measured. "About those reports you thought were suspicious." Sarah felt her heart rate spike but kept her expression neutral. "Oh, that. I realized I was probably just overthinking things. Still, I'd like to take a look at what you found," Margaret continued. "Why don't you show me which reports caught your attention?" This was a test. Margaret was trying to find out how much Sarah knew, and whether she'd continued investigating after being told to drop it. "I don't really remember the specific details," Sarah lied smoothly. "Like you said, analyzing intelligence isn't my job. I was probably just confused by the formatting differences." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that she was being evaluated by a predator, deciding whether its prey posed a threat. "Of course," Margaret finally said. "I'm glad you're focusing on your actual responsibilities. Speaking of which, I need you to work late tonight. We have a backlog of classified reports that need to be processed before tomorrow morning." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Margaret was arranging to have her alone in the building during a night shift, the same scenario she'd used to insert false intelligence reports. "Actually, I have plans tonight," Sarah said quickly. "Maybe I could come in early tomorrow instead." "I'm afraid tonight is the only option," Margaret replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "These reports are time-sensitive. I'll need you here by 8 p.m. After Margaret walked away, Sarah sat at her desk trying to control her panic. Margaret suspected something, and tonight's work session was likely a trap. But it was also an opportunity. If she could catch Margaret in the act of creating false intelligence, she'd have the proof she needed to expose the conspiracy. That afternoon, Sarah made her own preparations. She set up her secure phone to record video and audio, tucked a backup storage device into her shoe, and wrote a detailed summary of her investigation that she sealed in an envelope addressed to the FBI field office in Charlotte. If something happened to her tonight, at least the truth would eventually come to light. At 8 p.m. sharp, Sarah returned to the building. The usual daytime security guard had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize, a large man who watched her pass with cold, calculating eyes. Margaret was waiting in the filing area, but instead of the stacks of reports Sarah had expected, the workspace was eerily empty. "Where are the files you needed me to process?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. There are no files, Margaret said quietly. We need to talk. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her phone, but Margaret noticed the gesture. I wouldn't, Margaret warned. Security cameras have been temporarily disabled and the building is locked down. No one can get in or out without my authorization. The friendly, efficient supervisor was gone. In her place stood someone Sarah barely recognized. Cold, professional, and extremely dangerous. You're very good at your job, Sarah, Margaret continued. Too good. Your photographic memory is quite remarkable, but it's also made you a liability. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah said, backing slowly toward the exit. Of course you do. You've been investigating intelligence reports for weeks. You've identified patterns that shouldn't be visible to someone at your clearance level, and last night you accessed personnel files that contained information about night shift schedules. Sarah's heart sank. Margaret had been monitoring her computer access all along. The question, Margaret continued, is whether you've shared your findings with anyone else. Sarah forced herself to meet Margaret's gaze. I tried to report my concerns through proper channels. Lieutenant Commander Walsh and you both told me I was mistaken, so I dropped it. I don't believe you, Margaret said flatly. Someone with your intelligence and your unique abilities wouldn't give up that easily. You've continued investigating on your own, haven't you? When Sarah didn't respond, Margaret pulled out her phone and showed her a photograph. It was Sarah's car in the parking lot, taken from a high angle that suggested surveillance equipment had been installed in the building. You've been staying late, accessing files you have no business reviewing, Margaret said. Tonight, you're going to tell me exactly what you've discovered and who you've told about it. Sarah realized with growing horror that she'd walked into a carefully planned trap. Margaret had been watching her for days, possibly weeks, waiting for the right moment to neutralize the threat she posed. But Sarah had one advantage that Margaret didn't know about. Earlier that afternoon, she'd hidden copies of her evidence in 3 different locations around the building, using her access to areas that Margaret wouldn't think to check. I can give you everything I found, Sarah said, trying to buy time. But it's all stored on my computer upstairs. Margaret studied her suspiciously. We'll go together. And Sarah, if you try anything clever, you'll discover that my 20-year intelligence career taught me skills that go far beyond filing reports. As they walked toward the elevator, Sarah's mind raced through possible escape scenarios. The building was locked down, security cameras were disabled, and Margaret clearly had backup from the unfamiliar guard downstairs. But Sarah had spent 3 years learning every inch of this facility, including emergency exits and security protocols that Margaret might not know about. In the elevator, Margaret stood behind her, close enough that Sarah could feel her presence like a physical threat. When the doors opened on the main floor, Margaret directed her toward the analysis section where the secure computers were located. Open your files, Margaret commanded. Show me everything you found. Sarah sat at the computer and began accessing her investigation files, but she was also using the keyboard to execute a command sequence she'd memorized weeks ago, an emergency protocol that would send a distress signal to FBI cybersecurity monitoring systems. It was a desperate gamble, but it was her only chance to get word to the outside world before Margaret decided she knew too much to live. The signal would appear to be a routine system error, but it would also flag the facility for immediate security review. If Sarah was right about the monitoring protocols, federal agents would be dispatched within hours. She just had to survive that long. There, Sarah said, opening the files that contained her analysis of the false intelligence reports. This is everything I found. Margaret leaned over to study the screen, and Sarah saw her expression change as she realized the scope of what Sarah had uncovered. You really did figure it all out, Margaret said softly. The false reports, the pattern, even the timing correlations. I underestimated you. Why? Sarah asked, genuine curiosity overriding her fear. Why betray your own country? Margaret was quiet for a moment before answering. 20 years of watching politicians make decisions that get good people killed. 20 years of seeing intelligence ignored when it doesn't fit political narratives. I decided to work for people who actually value accurate information. By feeding false intelligence that got American soldiers wounded.
By exposing the weaknesses in a system that was already broken, Margaret snapped.
Do you think the intelligence community actually protects America? We're nothing but a tool for politicians who care more about their approval, ratings than national security. Sarah realized she was looking at someone who had become so disillusioned with the system that betraying it felt like patriotism. But patriotism didn't excuse treason, and Sarah wasn't going to let Margaret's twisted logic justify the deaths that would result from her actions. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Margaret closed the computer files and turned to face her directly. "Now you're going to help me clean up this mess. We're going to delete all evidence of your investigation, and then you're going to have an unfortunate accident." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain calm. Somewhere in the building, her hidden evidence waited to tell the story if she didn't survive the night. And outside, if her emergency signal had worked, federal agents were already mobilizing to investigate a potential security breach at Fort Braxton. Margaret might control the building tonight, but Sarah had set forces in motion that even a trained intelligence operative couldn't stop. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Sarah intended to make sure the truth survived even if she didn't. "An accident?" Sarah repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. "Like what happened to the other people who discovered your operation?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What other people?" Sarah was bluffing, but Margaret's reaction told her she'd hit a nerve. "You really think you're the first intelligence officer to turn traitor? Or that the FBI hasn't been tracking unusual patterns in classified communications?" It was a desperate gamble. But Sarah's photographic memory had caught something in the personnel files she'd reviewed. A notation about a security consultant who'd been killed in a car accident 6 months ago, right around the time the false reports had started appearing. "You're lying," Margaret said, but uncertainty flickered across her face. "Thomas Chen, cybersecurity specialist," Sarah continued, pulling the details from her memory, "died in a single car accident on Highway 74 after working late one night. But his final computer activity showed he'd been analyzing communication patterns in the intelligence database." Margaret went very still. "How do you know about Chen?" "Because I remember everything I read," Sarah said, standing up slowly from the computer. "Including the real reason you were so quick to dismiss my concerns yesterday. You killed him when he got too close to the truth, didn't you?" "Chen was a problem that solved itself," Margaret said coldly. "Just like you're about to be," but Sarah was already moving. Her 3 years in the building had taught her something Margaret couldn't know. The emergency lighting system had motion sensors that could be triggered to send automatic alerts to the security company. Sarah lunged toward the wall-mounted fire alarm and pulled it hard. Immediately, the building's emergency lighting system activated, bathing everything in flashing red light. More importantly, the alarm system was directly connected to the county emergency services and the FBI field office that monitored all federal facilities in the region. Margaret grabbed for Sarah, but Sarah had anticipated the move. Using her knowledge of the building layout burned into her photographic memory, she dodged between the desks in the dark, heading for the emergency stairwell that Margaret might not know led directly to an external exit. "You can't run forever," Margaret shouted over the alarm. "The building is locked down!" But Sarah wasn't running to escape. She was running to retrieve the evidence she'd hidden throughout the building. Her photographic memory guided her through the darkness to the first location, a maintenance panel near the stairwell where she'd taped a USB drive containing copies of all the false intelligence reports. Behind her, she could hear Margaret's footsteps and realized with growing dread that her supervisor was armed. The game had turned deadly, and Sarah was running out of options. She made it to the second evidence cache, hidden inside a filing cabinet in a different department, when the building's main lights suddenly came back on. Through the windows, Sarah could see vehicles arriving in the parking lot. Multiple black SUVs with government plates. Her emergency signal had worked. Federal agents, building secured. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "All personnel remain where you are." Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway, her service weapon drawn, but her expression now showing panic rather than confidence. She'd been trained for covert operations, not for dealing with a building full of federal agents responding to a security breach. "You have no idea what you've done," Margaret snarled. "The people I work for don't forgive loose ends." "Neither does the FBI," Sarah replied, backing toward the sound of boots thundering up the stairwell. The next few minutes were chaos. Federal agents swarmed the building, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness as they secured each floor. Sarah pressed herself against the wall as armed agents moved past her, their radios crackling with coordination chatter. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in an FBI windbreaker, approached her. "Agent Jennifer Martinez, FBI Counterintelligence. We received an automated distress signal from this location." "Margaret Kowalski," Sarah said quickly. "Records Management Supervisor. She's been inserting false intelligence reports into CIA communications for months. I have evidence hidden throughout the building." Agent Martinez spoke rapidly into her radio, while other agents spread out to search for Margaret. But Sarah's photographic memory was already reconstructing the building layout, analyzing potential escape routes that Margaret might use. "The service tunnel," Sarah said suddenly. "There's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the parking garage. She could reach her car without going through the main exits." Agent Martinez immediately relayed the information, and Sarah heard the tactical teams redirecting toward the basement levels. 20 minutes later, they brought Margaret out in handcuffs, but Margaret's capture was only the beginning. Over the next 12 hours, as Sarah provided FBI agents with every detail her photographic memory had recorded, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Margaret hadn't been working alone. The false intelligence operation was part of a larger network that included compromised officials in 3 different agencies. The information Sarah had uncovered led to arrests in Washington, Berlin, and Prague. Most importantly, Sarah's evidence allowed the FBI to identify and warn 17 CIA assets whose lives had been put at risk by the false intelligence reports. 3 major terrorist attacks were prevented when agents realized the all-clear signals had been fabricated. Lieutenant Commander Walsh arrived at the facility as the sun was rising, his usual confidence replaced by stunned disbelief. He found Sarah in the conference room, surrounded by stacks of evidence and giving her statement to federal investigators. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked up from the documents she was reviewing with Agent Martinez. "Just an apology?" Walsh had the grace to look embarrassed. "What you uncovered. The intelligence community owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Your photographic memory and analytical abilities saved American lives." "My photographic memory that you said was impossible?" Sarah asked pointedly. "I was wrong," Walsh admitted. "About everything. We should have listened to you from the beginning." Agent Martinez looked between them with interest. "Ms. Mitchell, the FBI would like to offer you a position with our counterintelligence division. Your unique abilities and demonstrated analytical skills make you exactly the kind of agent we need." Sarah considered the offer for a moment before responding. "I'll think about it. But first I want to finish what I started here." Over the following weeks, Sarah worked directly with FBI investigators to analyze 3 years' worth of intelligence reports stored in her perfect memory. Her ability to cross-reference thousands of documents led to the identification of 12 more compromised intelligence reports and the exposure of a spy network that had been operating for over 2 years. The intelligence community's initial dismissal of Sarah turned into something approaching reverence. Officials who had previously treated her as invisible support staff now sought her input on critical security matters. More importantly, Sarah's work led to fundamental changes in how intelligence reports were verified and cross-checked. New protocols were implemented that would make it much harder for future infiltrators to insert false information into the system. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon briefing room, wearing the crisp uniform of a newly commissioned FBI special agent. She was presenting her analysis of foreign intelligence patterns to a room full of generals and agency directors, the same people who had once dismissed her as just the filing girl. "The key to preventing future infiltration," Sarah told the assembled officials, "is understanding that the most valuable intelligence often comes from the people you least expect. Every person with access to classified information is a potential asset in protecting national security, but only if their observations are taken seriously." As she concluded her presentation, Sarah thought about Margaret Kowalski, now serving a life sentence in federal prison for espionage. Margaret had been right about one thing: the intelligence system had been broken, but instead of betraying it, Sarah had helped fix it. Agent Martinez approached Sarah after the briefing. "Ready for your first field assignment?" Sarah smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from the invisible file clerk who'd been mocked for her impossible memory. and dismissed for her paranoid fantasies.